Thank you for joining us for this sermon podcast from United Christian Church of Austin, where no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're invited and welcome. This sermon from March 1st, 2015 is entitled, Just Plain Hungry. It's a reflection on a reading from the Gospel according to John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. If you'd like to learn more about our open and affirming ministry at United Christian Church, head over to our website, www.uccaustin.org. Thank you.
Our reading today comes from the New Testament, from the Gospel according to John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. May God take these words and make them from the Holy Word for us today. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up to the mountain and sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festivals of Jews, was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for those who eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew that he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among many people?" Jesus said, making the people sit down. Now that the great deal of grass in the place, so that they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into this world." Friends, God is still speaking to the world. May our hearts be open to listen and respond. Amen.
So there's a downside to having to supply a title for a sermon, for a Sunday worship service. The downside really is that the sermon title so often has to be written days ahead of the actual sermon itself, because that title has to go in the Sunday bulletin, which is printed quite timely fashion in the church office during the middle of the week. And that sermon, well, let's just say it's not. And sometimes, of course, you try and come up with a wonderful sermon title, and it really guides your writing, and eventually you end up there with a nice little package tied up with a bow of a sermon title. And sometimes, as you're approaching that sermon writing, it just takes a left turn for you. And sometimes you know that's going to happen. You have an inkling that's probably the way it's going to turn out, and you can choose a rather more broad sermon title. If you ever see the title Amazing Grace in the bulletin, you know that I have little to no idea when that sermon title goes in and what's going to come out on Sunday. Amazing Grace really just covers everything. I was told as I was preparing for my confirmation class when I was a kid that if I didn't know the answer to any of the questions that the elders asked me, I should just answer, "By God's good grace." And that would probably be right. Sometimes, though, you think you've got an idea of where it's going, and it just doesn't happen. This week is one of those weeks. So you've got the sermon title printed there, full of it. And I would invite you and would really love to hear your guesses of where I was going to go with that sermon title. It's certainly not where I ended up. But I count on God's good grace to cover me regardless. So we're taking time during this Lenten season to talk about hunger and fasting. Specifically, we're talking about our human hungers for justice, for beauty, for real connection. Hungers that may distract and maybe even distort our loving relationships with God and our neighbors and even ourselves. And we're talking about the spiritual discipline of fasting, an ancient practice. Fasting, much as the youth of our congregation and their friends from Friends Congregational Church, UCC, and College Station were undertaking on our behalf here this weekend in the 30-hour famine. Fasting that helps us to refocus our attention and our intentions on those relationships with God and our neighbors and ourselves, with the whole world around us. And it also helps us to grow in solidarity with folks for whom going without or giving up the things that we may take for granted in our lives is not in fact a choice, but rather an inescapable, rock-solid fact of life. And so as we pursue this path during Lent, I want to make sure that we don't over-spiritualize the experience, as the church has been wont to do from time to time in the past. Not just this congregation, of course, but the church writ large. I want to make sure that we don't rapture the reality of hunger right out of our bodies and into some abstract, ethereal idea of hunger merely as metaphor. You know, the way that Jesus' bold beatitude and that blessed are the poor in Luke gets widened and watered down into blessed are the poor in spirit by the time it appears in Matthew. Those are two things that are similar, to be sure, but not quite the same. Blessed are the poor and blessed are the poor in spirit. It's like the difference we saw this past fall between the strong Twitter hashtag Black Lives Matter and the subsequent well-intentioned but weakened All Lives Matter. Similar, but not the same. And so today, in order to do that, I want to talk about hunger. Just plain hunger. There's your sermon title for you. And so in order to do that, I want to start with a feeding story from the Gospels. It seems that Jesus was always sitting down to a meal with someone, and usually someone really unexpected. That table fellowship was clearly an integral part of Jesus' understanding, one of his central metaphors for our lives together and with God. Specifically, I want to talk about the story that we read from the Gospel according to John, the feeding of the 5,000, a story the early church clearly thought was so important that they told it in all four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and here in John, and told it even sometimes twice in the same Gospel. No kidding. Each version of the story adds or edits out certain details, much the way that if we were all trying to remember the same event, the same story, we would have different things that we would remember better or worse, things we would leave out or embellish. Some say that what happened at the end of a very long day of listening to Jesus' teaching. Some remember the oddly specific detail of how green the grass was in that place. I picked this version from the Gospel according to John because it mentions that little boy with his lunch that we may remember from our own Sunday school days. It's one of the few stories that mentions children in the Gospels, and so one that we are happy to share with our children in the course of their religious education. All the versions agree, though, that there was a great crowd come out to the outskirts of town, to a wild place, to hear and see and to be with Jesus. Some 4,000 or 5,000 men, not to mention women and children. Literally, not mentioning women and children. And all agree that the crowd was hungry. And out there, away from their homes, away from their villages, they didn't have access to the food that they would need to feed themselves. It was a disaster in the making. And so in John, Jesus turns to his disciples and asks them the awkward and impossible question, where are we to buy bread for them to eat? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's even worse. Jesus looks right at the disciples and tells them, you give them something to eat. Oh yeah, sure, Jesus, they reply. With what? Just these 5 little loaves and 2 measly fish? Well, you ask a silly question, because that's exactly what happened. Jesus blessed their meager meal, and what was patently not enough became more than enough. More than enough for a multitude, with lots and lots left over. 12 baskets full. Some scholars debate, particularly in progressive Christian circles, over just what happened that day. Resistant to the idea of a straight-up supernatural miracle. Some scholars have suggested that folks in the crowd actually already had enough food for themselves, but were reluctant to share with the larger crowd. I know that never happens to us. We are always eager and more than eager to share what we have with those who are in need. But these people, they had it wrong. And they resisted. Resisted, that is, until they were inspired, or as I like to say, creatively shamed by the selfless example of the little boy who gladly gave up his lunch just to be helpful. The example of the 30 or so youth who've gone without food for 30 hours to raise their consciousness and ours around the issue of hunger. Then out came the picnic baskets and the bottles of wine and the cold fried chicken, and voila, a feast for 5,000 and more. As if getting a tired and hungry crowd to share what they had was really any less of a miracle than magically multiplying those loaves and fish. I dare you to try either one. You'll probably have just about as much luck. Either way, it's a ta-da moment, a voila moment in the midst of the gospel that the church wanted to remember. And so they wrote it down and handed it down to us. But today, I want to focus less on the miracle end of this story and more on the mission end. I want to focus our attention not on what Jesus did so much, but on what Jesus asked the disciples to do. That, after all, really is the heart of the story, and it's what Jesus wanted to happen. When the disciples noticed how hungry the crowd was, they came to Jesus with their concerns and their doubts. Half a year's wages wouldn't buy enough food for them all, Jesus. And where are we going to get that kind of money? I don't need to remind you that most of us left our jobs to come here and follow you. And even if we had it, where would we find the food, for heaven's sake? Hey, the way I see it, they forgot to bring food. It's on their heads. Let them go hungry. Let them go away and feed themselves, at least, if they can. And if they can't, well, maybe that will incentivize them to go out and find work and work a little harder until they can afford it. You know, a handout won't help. You're not doing any good. You can't coddle these people, Jesus. No, Jesus said. You give them something to eat. You feed them. Feed my sheep. This is something that is near and dear to the heart of the gospel. Right along with spreading the spiritual good news of eternal salvation. Feeding hungry people. This is part of the mission. Jesus is still asking the church today, asking us to feed hungry people. And God knows there are still hungry people to feed. Hunger is the feeling, the ache in your belly, the distraction to your mental and emotional state, the gnawing at your soul over time of having not enough. Food insecurity is that situation where an individual or a household is hungry or facing the risk of being hungry. If you are food insecure, you may have food tonight or for tomorrow, but every day it's a financial juggling act where sometimes it's the food ball that gets dropped. Sometimes you or your little child or your elderly parent, sometimes you just got to go to bed hungry and hope for better tomorrow. 17.5 million American households face food insecurity this year. And Texas, ranks number 3 as the hungriest state in the nation. 4.7 million people statewide face food insecurity. Nearly 500,000 people, nearly 500,000 of them right here in the central Texas area. You know, one of the hubs of the much touted Texas economic miracle. And the majority of them, contrary to the stories that you may have told, contrary to the meta-media narrative, most of them are working families who still can't parlay that wage into a guarantee to make ends meet day in and day out, to put food on their tables in a consistent way. The Capital Area Food Bank, from which we heard last week during our faith formation time, they report that of 2/3 of the people they serve here in the greater Austin area say they have had to choose between buying food and paying for housing in the last year. 80% of them, 80% of them say they had to choose between food and medicine. And that's not just in low-income neighborhoods across town. You know, the usual suspects for hunger across the tracks. Increasingly, friends, that's in our neighborhoods. Not that it should matter, but it is increasingly. It's in our neighborhoods, not just in the city, but in the suburbs as well. Who knows what lies behind that facade of the happy home? This summer, I was thinking back, this summer and this fall, just the barest, slightest shadow of the fear of an imagined Ebola outbreak passed over our country, and we went into panic mode and mobilized resources and spent millions. And yet, as a nation, it's inescapable. We are caught in the grip of an actual epidemic, a real epidemic of hunger and the chronic poverty that drives it. And our elected officials in Congress proposed reducing funding to the SNAP program, what used to be food stamps. They proposed reducing funding to the SNAP program of food assistance 13 times in the last Congress. And lucky them, they succeeded in kicking 2 million Americans off the rolls. Friends, this is a physical problem, but it's a spiritual problem as well. It's our spiritual problem. This pervasive and persistent hunger gnaws away at the fabric of our lives, gnaws away at our neighbors, and undermines the soul of our nation. Why can't we be our brothers and sisters' keepers? Why can't we provide a safety net so that even should they stumble, they will not fall headlong into the kind of poverty that stifles the spirit and kills the body? Why can't we and why don't we look to the basic needs of our neighbors, knowing full well in enlightened self-interest that we rise or fall as a nation together? If Jesus looked to his disciples to feed that hungry crowd when they clearly did not have the resources to do the job themselves, what will Jesus say to us? What is Jesus saying to us when we do? You feed my sheep. You, share what you have. You, serve your sisters and brothers. You, change the world. For the church, that's our mission. For the world, that would be a miracle. Even as Jesus blessed those 5 loaves and 2 fish, God promises to bless our efforts to feed the hungry people in our midst, but we have to be willing to make some. We are already so richly blessed. Richly blessed as a church, as a community, as a nation. Maybe this is why. Maybe God has already set the table in us. Maybe our mission is the miracle the world hungers for, body and soul. Maybe it's the miracle we need in the church as well. And so, friends, if you've heard the word of God preached here today, remember to give all honor and glory to our one God, Creator, Christ, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Hera, hera, hera,